It was a courtroom drama no one saw coming, the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and the lengths people will go to protect their lies. The air was thick with tension as the gavel slammed, signaling the start of a trial that would soon spiral into chaos. On one side of the room stood two white police officers, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. They were confident, too confident. On the other side sat a black man, calm but visibly frustrated, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. To everyone in the room, he was just another defendant, another name on the docket. But what they didn't know was that this man was hiding a secret so explosive it would turn the entire case upside down. The officers took the stand, one after the other, their testimonies rehearsed and polished. They painted a picture of a dangerous man, a criminal who had resisted arrest, threatened their lives, and flouted the law. Their words were sharp, deliberate, designed to convince the jury beyond a shadow of a doubt. The prosecutor nodded along, confident in the narrative they were weaving. But as the defense attorney began her cross-examination, something felt off. The man at the center of it all, let's call him Marcus, sat quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like a man who had given up. He looked like a man who was waiting for the right moment to strike. The defense attorney's questions grew sharper, more pointed. She pressed the officers on inconsistencies in their stories, on gaps in their timeline, on details that didn't add up. The officers stumbled, their confidence wavering for the first time. And then, just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Marcus raised his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "May I approach the bench?" The judge hesitated, clearly caught off guard, but nodded. Marcus stood, walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, and reached into his pocket. The room held its breath. What happened next would leave everyone, judge, jury, officers, and spectators, stunned. Marcus pulled out a small, unassuming badge and placed it on the bench. It wasn't just any badge. It was a CIA clearance card, the kind only given to those with the highest levels of security access. The room erupted in murmurs, the officers' faces pale as they realized the gravity of their mistake. This wasn't just any man they had accused. This was a man with connections, with power, with the ability to dismantle their lies with a single phone call. The judge stared at the badge, then at Marcus, then at the officers who were now visibly sweating. "Explain yourselves," the judge demanded, his voice low and dangerous. But before the officers could respond, Marcus leaned in and whispered something to the judge. Whatever he said, it was enough to make the judge's eyes widen in shock. He immediately called for a recess, leaving the courtroom in a state of chaos. As the officers were escorted out, their confident smirks replaced with panic, Marcus sat back down, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The jury was dismissed, the spectators were buzzing with speculation, and the prosecutor looked like he'd just seen a ghost. What had Marcus said to the judge? What did his CIA clearance mean for the case? And most importantly, how far were the officers willing to go to cover up their lies? The answers to those questions would come later. For now, the courtroom was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a showdown, one that would expose secrets, challenge power, and force everyone involved to confront the truth. And as the doors to the courtroom closed, one thing was clear. This story was far from over. The recess felt like an eternity. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, each person trying to piece together what had just happened. Spectators exchanged theories, reporters scrambled to make sense of the bombshell revelation, and the officers sat in a corner, their heads bowed, their earlier bravado replaced with palpable unease. Marcus, however, remained calm. He sat quietly at the defense table, his hands resting on the surface, his expression unreadable. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. If he was angry, he kept it buried deep. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man who had been through this before, a man who knew how to wait for the right moment to act. But who was Marcus, really? That was the question on everyone's mind. The CIA clearance card had thrown the entire case into disarray, and now the story behind it was all anyone could talk about. The truth was, Marcus wasn't just some random guy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had a history, one that was far more complicated than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. Born and raised in a rough neighborhood, Marcus had always been smart, resourceful, and determined to rise above the circumstances he was born into. He joined the military straight out of high school, serving multiple tours overseas. It was there that he caught the attention of intelligence agencies. His sharp mind, ability to stay calm under pressure, and knack for solving problems made him a perfect candidate for covert operations. By the time he left the military, he had already been recruited by the CIA. But Marcus wasn't your typical spy. He didn't fit the Hollywood stereotype of a shadowy figure in a trench coat, lurking in dark alleys. He was a family man, a father of two, who had always tried to balance his demanding job with his personal life. He didn't talk about his work, not to his wife, not to his kids, not to anyone. It was a rule he lived by, one that had kept him and his loved ones safe. But now that rule had been broken. His cover was blown, and the life he had worked so hard to protect was suddenly at risk. The incident that led to his arrest had started as a simple misunderstanding. Marcus had been driving home from a late-night meeting when he was pulled over by the two officers. They claimed he had been speeding, but Marcus knew better. He had been careful, always mindful of the rules, especially when he was carrying sensitive information. When the officers approached his car, he cooperated fully, handing over his license and registration without a word. But things escalated quickly. One of the officers claimed to smell marijuana, though Marcus hadn't smoked in years. They ordered him out of the car, and when he hesitated, just for a moment, they yanked him out, cuffed him, and threw him to the ground. Marcus didn't resist. He knew better than to fight back. But as he lay there, his face pressed against the asphalt, he couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just a routine stop. Was it a setup, a test, or was it simply what it looked like? Another case of racial profiling gone wrong. The officers searched his car, their movements aggressive and hurried. They found nothing illegal, nothing suspicious. But instead of letting him go, they arrested him anyway, charging him with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Marcus knew the charges were bogus, but he also knew how the system worked. He had seen it firsthand, both in his line of work and in his personal life. He knew that for a black man, the truth didn't always matter. What mattered was the story, the narrative, the power dynamics at play, and in this case, the officers had all the power. But Marcus wasn't just any black man. He was a man with resources, with connections, with a level of clearance that most people could only dream of. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could turn the tables. And that's exactly what he did. From the moment he was arrested, he began gathering evidence. He recorded conversations, documented every detail, and reached out to his contacts at the CIA. He knew it would take time, but he was willing to wait. He had to, for his family, for his reputation, for the truth. Now, as he sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge to return, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The officers had underestimated him, just like so many others had before. They had assumed he was powerless, just another statistic in a broken system. But they were wrong. And now, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The judge returned to the bench, his expression stern. He called the court back to order, but the tension in the room was thicker than ever. The prosecutor stood, clearly flustered, and asked for a private meeting with the judge. The defense attorney objected, arguing that whatever was said should be heard in open court. The judge hesitated, then agreed. "Proceed," he said, his voice firm. The prosecutor took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Your Honor," he began, "we were not aware of the defendant's affiliations. Given the sensitive nature of this information, we request that the case be dismissed." The room erupted in gasps. The officers looked like they'd been punched in the gut. Marcus, however, remained calm. He had expected this, he had planned for it. But he also knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Dismissed?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "On what grounds?" The prosecutor hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Your Honor, given the defendant's position, it's clear that this case is more complicated than we initially thought. We believe it would be in the best interest of justice." Enough," the judge interrupted, slamming his gavel. "This court does not operate on beliefs, it operates on facts. And the fact is, serious allegations have been made, not just against the defendant, but against the officers involved. This case will not be dismissed. It will be investigated. Thoroughly." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The game was far from over, but he had just scored a major victory. The officers, however, looked like they were about to collapse. One of them whispered something to the other, his face pale, his hands trembling. Whatever they were hiding, it was clear they were running out of time. As the judge adjourned the court for the day, Marcus stood, his mind already racing with what came next. He knew the officers wouldn't go down without a fight. He knew there were forces at play that he couldn't yet see. But he also knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus stepped out of the courtroom. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on his shoulders. The cool evening air did little to ease the tension coiled in his chest. Reporters swarmed the steps of the courthouse, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions. "Mr. Johnson, can you comment on the CIA clearance? What's your response to the officer's allegations? Do you believe this was a case of racial profiling?" Marcus kept his head down, his lawyer shielding him as they pushed through the crowd. He didn't answer any of the questions. He couldn't, not yet. There was too much at stake. Meanwhile, across town, the two officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Harris, sat in a dimly lit bar, their uniforms replaced with civilian clothes, their earlier confidence shattered. Daniels nursed a whiskey, his hand still shaking, while Harris stared at his phone, scrolling through the news headlines that were already blowing up. CIA agent exposes police misconduct. Courtroom shock. Black man reveals secret identity. Officers under fire. In high-stakes legal battle, Harris slammed his phone down on the table, his face twisted in frustration. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "How the hell did we not know who he was?" Daniels didn't answer right away. He was too busy replaying the events of the traffic stop in his mind. Had they missed something? Had they been set up, or had they simply made a mistake, one that was now going to cost them everything? "We need to get ahead of this," Daniels finally said, his voice low. "If we don't, we're finished." But getting ahead of it wasn't going to be easy. The department was already distancing itself from the officers, releasing a vague statement about cooperating fully with the investigation. Internal. Affairs had launched a probe, and rumors were swirling about past incidents involving Daniels and Harris. Neither officer had a spotless record, and now, every decision they'd ever made was under scrutiny. Harris had been accused of excessive force twice before, though the charges had been dropped. Daniels had a reputation for being aggressive, especially in neighborhoods like the one where Marcus had been pulled over. Neither of them had ever faced consequences. Until now. As the officers plotted their next move, Marcus was meeting with his lawyer in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Claire Bennett, had been with him from the beginning. She was one of the few people who knew the full extent of his story, and she was determined to see it through to the end. "This isn't just about you," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "This is about exposing a system that's been broken for far too long. But you need to be careful. These guys aren't going to go down without a fight." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He knew Claire was right. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about holding people accountable, about sending a message that no one was above the law, no matter who they were or what badge they wore. But it was also personal. Marcus had spent his life fighting for justice, both at home and abroad. He had seen what happened when power went unchecked, when lies were allowed to fester. He couldn't let that happen here, not in his own backyard. As the night wore on, the stakes grew higher. Anonymous sources began leaking details about the case to the press, each revelation more damning than the last. Texts between Daniels and Harris surfaced, showing them discussing the traffic stop in chilling detail. "Let's teach this guy a lesson," one message read. "Make sure he knows who's in charge." The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted outside the police station, with activists demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for the officers. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "Cops Must Go" trending nationwide. But not everyone was on Marcus's side. There were those who saw him as a threat, a man with too much power, too many secrets. Whispers of conspiracy theories began to circulate, suggesting that Marcus had orchestrated the entire thing to discredit the police. Some even claimed he was a rogue agent, using his CIA clearance to manipulate the system. These rumors, though baseless, gained traction in certain circles, adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Marcus tried to stay focused, but the pressure was mounting. His wife, Lisa, had been fielding calls from worried family members and nosy reporters. His kids, though too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense that something was wrong. "Daddy, are you in trouble?" his daughter had asked the night before, her big brown eyes filled with worry. Marcus had hugged her tightly, promising everything would be okay. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Marcus received a call from an old friend at the CIA. "You've got a target on your back," the friend warned. "There are people who don't want this story to get out. Be careful." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He knew how these things worked. When the truth threatened powerful people, they didn't just sit back and let it unfold. They fought back, and they fought dirty. As the investigation deepened, new details emerged that only added to the mystery. Security footage from the night of the traffic stop showed Marcus's car being followed by an unmarked vehicle moments before he was pulled over. Who was in that car? And why were they following him? The footage was grainy, but it was enough to raise questions that no one seemed willing to answer. The judge, meanwhile, was growing increasingly impatient. He had ordered a full review of the case, including an examination of the officer's records and any potential connections to Marcus. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end, every piece of evidence raising more questions than answers. It was as if there were forces at work behind the scenes, pulling strings, covering tracks, and ensuring that the truth remained just out of reach. By the end of the week, the tension was palpable. Marcus, Daniels, Harris, Claire, the judge, the prosecutor, they were all caught in a web of lies, secrets, and half-truths, each one desperate to come out on top. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war, one that would test their limits, their loyalties, and their very understanding of justice. And in the middle of it all was Marcus, a man who had spent his life fighting for others, now fighting for himself. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. The truth was out there, and he was going to find it, no matter the cost.